The year was 1177. A late November sun hung over the Holy Land, burning far hotter than the season allowed, turning every stone and ridge into a shimmering furnace. Imagine standing there on that dusty plain, beside 500 exhausted knights, whose horses foamed at the mouth and trembled with every breath. They had marched nearly 2 days without proper rest, pushed at a pace that should have killed half of them, and yet they stood, leaning on their lances, armor blazing under the cruel heat. And on the horizon, rising like a storm of locusts, stretched the thing every man had feared, the army of Saladin. Not 20,000 as scouts first believed. 26,000. 26,000 against 500. A ratio so absurd that even the most hardened veterans felt their stomach tighten in dread. It was not a battle formation. It was the mathematics of annihilation. And yet, impossibly, within 2 hours of open combat, 20,000 of those warriors would lie dead. The greatest Muslim force assembled since the First Crusade would be shattered, and a young king, dying, disfigured, barely able to hold a sword, would do what the world swore could never be done. That king was Baldwin IV of Jerusalem, 16 years old, a leper since childhood, his hands wrapped in silk because his flesh split at the slightest pressure, his face hidden behind a silver mask so that courtiers need not bear the sight of the disease consuming him. Physicians had told him he should have died 3 years earlier. Each morning he continued to wake was a defiance of nature. Each time he mounted a horse was an act of sheer will greater than any weapon he carried. And on the other side stood Saladin, conqueror, unifier of Egypt and Syria, commander of more than 100,000 warriors across his dominions. He was the most respected general of his age, a master of both war and statecraft, so feared that entire Christian towns had surrendered upon hearing his banners were near. Compared to his power, the kingdom of Jerusalem appeared nothing more than a fragile outpost in the desert. Inside Jerusalem itself, nobles quietly loaded their treasure onto ships anchored at Acre and Tyre, preparing to flee before the inevitable fall. Negotiations for surrender had already begun in secret halls. The entire kingdom could muster perhaps 15,000 soldiers in total, scattered across castles and fortresses far from one another. Even if every garrison had marched at once, they would still be outnumbered. Saladin's current army alone, this force of 26,000, was nearly double the entire military strength of the Crusader states combined. But Baldwin had only 500 knights with him. 80 of them were Templars, the warrior monks sworn to never retreat, never surrender, never pity an enemy of the cross. The rest were secular knights and a few thousand footmen, many little more than desperate peasants clutching farm tools in place of proper weapons. Against them, Saladin marched with 8,000 elite Mamluk cavalry, soldiers raised from childhood to fight like living weapons. And yet the king, half broken by disease, chose to ride out. The council chamber in Jerusalem had dissolved into panic when scouts confirmed Saladin was bypassing Ascalon and marching straight for the holy city. The garrison inside the walls was barely 1,000 men, old, young, wounded, unfit for a true fight. Raymond of Tripoli, the kingdom's most seasoned commander, begged Baldwin to flee north. "The kingdom needs its king alive," he said. Others pleaded the same. Some whispered that terms of surrender must be negotiated immediately. The mood in the room was so grim that even Renaud of Châtillon, who had never once advised peace, remained silent. Then the dying boy did something none of them expected. He demanded to be lifted so he could sit upright. Pain rippled across his face, hidden beneath his silver mask, but his voice carried through the chamber, steady and unbroken. "I may die tomorrow or 10 years from now, but I will die as I lived, defending this kingdom. God gave me this disease for a purpose. When victory comes, none will claim it was by human strength alone." The knights stared at him, stunned. Victory? Against 26,000? It seemed the words of someone overcome by illness, but Odo de Saint-Amand, Grand Master of the Templars, understood first. If a dying king could face doom with courage, how could his warrior monks do less? Slowly, one by one, they knelt, not in submission, but in belief. The room that moments earlier brimmed with despair now filled with a fierce, impossible hope. And then Baldwin gave the order that defied all strategy, all reason, all sanity. They would march out immediately and strike Saladin before he reached Jerusalem. No resting, no fortifying the city, no waiting for reinforcements that would never come. The knights would ride to meet the approaching horde head-on. The march that followed became legend. 45 miles in 36 hours. Men in full chainmail collapsing from heat. Horses stumbling, bleeding, then pushed onward again. Baldwin drifted in and out of consciousness, his body racked by spasms so severe that Templars had to strap him to his saddle and later carry him on a litter. Each time he woke, gasping, trembling, he whispered the same 2 words: "Continue on." Meanwhile, Saladin had made the fatal mistake that would cost him everything. Believing the Christians too terrified to leave their walls, he allowed his army to spread out freely across 3 miles of countryside. Foraging parties scattered, horse lines stretched widely, formations collapsed into casual clustering. Why maintain discipline when the enemy was expected to surrender without a fight? His emirs were already arguing over which lands they would receive after Jerusalem fell. But before dawn on November 25th, Baldwin's scouts brought news that electrified even the most exhausted knight. The Muslim army was scattered and unprepared. For the first time since leaving the city, men who had been stumbling like ghosts straightened their backs. God, or fate, or the desperate genius of a dying king, had delivered an opportunity no commander could have hoped for. By noon, clouds of dust to the north warned Saladin that something unexpected was approaching. He dismissed the reports at first. Baldwin would never leave Jerusalem undefended. It must be a small raiding party. But soon, the truth became undeniable. The banners appearing on the ridgeline were not scout pennants. They were the great standards of war. The Red Cross of the Templars, the Golden Crosses of Jerusalem, the personal banner of Baldwin Thopfor himself. Saladin's scattered regiments began to panic, racing to reform lines that had taken hours to unravel. Officers shouted conflicting orders in Arabic, Kurdish, and Turkish, trying to pull coherence out of chaos. But Baldwin had no intention of allowing them the time. He asked to be lifted into the saddle. His legs were no longer functional. His hands barely held the reins. Blood seeped through the silk wrapped around his fingers. But when he raised his sword, 500 knights knew the moment had come. David faced Goliath with faith, he declared. Today, we face 26,000 the same way. A roar thundered across the plain as lances dropped and 500 war horses surged forward in a single, unstoppable wave. The charge began like a sound before it became a sight. A deep, rolling tremor rippled through the earth as 500 armored war horses descended from the ridge, gathering momentum with terrifying speed. At their spear point rode the 80 Templars, their black and white standards snapping violently in the wind. To the Muslim soldiers scattered across the plain, the sight made no sense. 500 against 26,000 was not bravery. It was suicide. For a moment, an instant that would shape the fate of empires, many simply froze, unable to comprehend what they were witnessing. The Templar wedge struck first. They hit the half-formed Muslim center with the force of a falling mountain, ashwood lances splintering as they punched through armor, bone, and flesh. More than 300 Mamluk cavalrymen were crushed or impaled in the first heartbeat of impact. The noise was monstrous. Iron smashing into iron, horses screaming, men shouting prayers and curses that vanished beneath the roar of collision. But the true shock was not the casualties. It was the fact that the Templars did not wheel away after the initial strike. Instead, they drove forward, deeper, like a blade seeking the heart of a giant. Behind them, Baldwin's 420 secular knights crashed into the gap the Templars had torn. The two waves fused into one devastating, unstoppable momentum, and the Muslim center, 8,000 strong, began to buckle. Not retreat. Buckle. Like a dam giving way under pressure it was never meant to withstand. Arrows rained down as the knights advanced, blackening the sky, falling so densely that horses tumbled and men vanished beneath the chaos. But the Crusaders did not slow. Some were hit and slumped forward, but their horses kept charging, carrying lifeless riders as though guided by fury itself. One Templar warhorse, its master dead, continued running wildly into Muslim ranks, biting, kicking, trampling anything in its path. 17 arrows lodged in its body before it finally collapsed, but not before its madness shattered an entire squadron. Saladin watched from his command position, gripping his golden mace so tightly that it slipped from his hand. He simply could not believe what he saw. Never in his life had he witnessed 500 knights push back his elite center. The greatest commander of the age stood momentarily stunned, unable to reconcile the impossible with reality. And then the impossible deepened. Hidden behind a low rise during the cavalry charge, Baldwin's 3,000 infantry emerged on the Muslim flank. To the disorganized soldiers of Saladin, who were already struggling to understand how the Crusader cavalry had reached them so quickly, the sudden appearance of fresh infantry felt like an army materializing from thin air. Panic spread like wildfire. Cries of "We are surrounded" surged through the ranks. It wasn't true, but panic does not reason. Baldwin, strapped to his saddle and bleeding from his bandaged hands, raised his sword high. Chronicles from both Christian and Muslim records agree that it should not have been possible. His hands were too damaged, his body too frail, but the young king lifted the blade anyway, and his knights, seeing it, howled with renewed fury. At 50 yards, the horses of the Muslim front line sensed what their riders could not yet admit. Animals feel doom long before men do. They began stepping backward, ears pinned, muscles trembling. Once that first line faltered, the ripple became a wave. The ground shook beneath thousands of hooves as fear passed through the Muslim army like a shadow. And then, at last, the breaking point came. As the Crusader avalanche tore deeper into the Muslim center, the ravines scattered across the plain. Those cracks in the earth that Baldwin had noticed earlier began turning into traps. Muslim cavalry tried to fall back, only to be funneled into narrow channels where they were crushed together, unable to maneuver, unable to flee. What from a distance looked like an open plain was in truth a labyrinth of death. By mid-afternoon, the left wing of Saladin's army began to drift backward. Drift became retreat. Retreat became collapse. Orders from officers were drowned by the noise of thousands trying to escape simultaneously. The weight of 26,000 men panicking in close quarters created a chaos that no commander, not even Saladin, could control. Then came the moment Muslim chroniclers would later call divine punishment. Saladin's personal guard, 2,000 elite Mamluks, warriors who would rather die than flee, broke. They turned their steeds and ran. Men who had fought Mongols and Byzantines without fear now fled from a charge they could not comprehend. The sight shattered what remained of the Muslim morale. If the Sultan's own guard had abandoned him, what hope was left for the common soldier? Saladin himself made a desperate choice. His war horse was too slow under the weight of his armor, so he mounted a racing camel, an act which later haunted him more than the defeat itself. The image of their great sultan fleeing atop a pack animal dealt the final blow to Muslim resistance. His golden armor flashed once in the afternoon sun before he disappeared into the rising dust, leaving behind an army disintegrating faster than he could save it. The Crusaders surged after them. The battle no longer resembled combat. It had become slaughter. For 2 hours, the knights pursued the fleeing forces across the plain and into the ravines, cutting them down with swords, maces, broken lances, or anything left in their hands. The ravines filled with bodies so densely that the dead formed gruesome bridges over which others stumbled. Horses slipped on blood-soaked earth. Men screamed, prayed, begged, and died beneath a relentless tide of iron and fury. No historian since has fully explained how 500 knights, exhausted from a punishing march, maintained such stamina during the pursuit. The chronicles give only one answer: that something beyond human strength had carried them. Christian writers claimed God's hand guided them. Muslim writers, horrified, agreed in their own way, saying that Allah had turned his face from them that day. And through it all, Baldwin fought. The pain in his body was so intense that knights swore they saw tears of blood seeping from beneath his silver mask. Yet he never faltered. His sword rose and fell, directing the battle, shaping the slaughter, driving his men forward until the last Muslim survivor vanished into the distance. By late afternoon, more than 20,000 of Saladin's soldiers lay dead. The Crusaders, only 3,500 engaged, including infantry, had lost about 110. A terrible toll, yet nothing compared to the catastrophe suffered by the Islamic host. The plain was carpeted in bodies, the ravines choked with the dead, weapons and banners scattered like splinters of a shattered empire. And still the day was not finished. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, the battlefield grew eerily quiet, broken only by the ragged breaths of collapsing war horses and the soft clatter of armor settling into the dust. The Crusader pursuit finally came to an end, not because they willed it, but because their mounts could run no farther. Many of the proud destriers simply fell beneath their riders, muscles trembling, lungs heaving until they gave out entirely. These creatures had been pushed beyond mortal limits, yet they had carried their masters through a miracle that would echo across generations. Baldwin himself could no longer remain upright. The moment his horse collapsed, knights rushed to catch him, fearing he had died from the unimaginable strain of the battle. His body shook violently. His bandages, once white, were soaked with fresh blood. But even in that delirious agony, he pushed their hands away and commanded one final act before he would allow himself to rest. Surrounded by 20,000 dead enemies, beneath a sky still swirling with dust and smoke, the Leper King ordered his army to kneel. And there, on the field of Montcussard, 500 blood-stained warriors sank to their knees in prayer. Many could barely stay upright. Some wept, Others stared silently at the carnage around them, unable to comprehend what they had survived. Baldwin's voice, weak but unwavering, rose above them all. Non nobis, Domine, non nobis, sed nomini tuo de gloriam. Not unto us, O Lord, not unto us, but to your name give the glory. It was a scene so surreal that even hardened soldiers would remember it until their dying breath. The sight of men who moments earlier had been unstoppable engines of destruction, now kneeling like penitents among mountains of fallen foes. While the Crusaders prayed, Saladin fled across the desert, his pride shattered as deeply as his army. He reached Cairo with fewer than 2,000 survivors, many wounded, all haunted by what they had witnessed. The Sultan, who had never known defeat, entered the city not on a triumphant steed, but on the racing camel that had saved his life and ruined his honor. Rumors spread faster than the truth. Some claimed he had abandoned his men. Others whispered that divine wrath had descended on the battlefield. Mosques filled with mourners demanding answers. Scholars struggled to reconcile the catastrophic defeat with their understanding of God's will. The political consequences were immediate and severe. Saladin's authority, built carefully over decades through alliances and victories, suffered its first fracture. Rivals in Syria questioned his leadership. Some of his supporters quietly defected. Egypt, the foundation of his empire, trembled with uncertainty. It would take him nearly 10 years to rebuild an army comparable to the one annihilated in that single afternoon. Meanwhile, the Crusader states, long stretched thin and teetering on the brink of collapse, suddenly found themselves holding unthinkable wealth. Saladin had brought his entire war treasury with him, planning for a prolonged occupation of Jerusalem once the city fell. Now that treasure, gold, weapons, armor, horses, supplies for tens of thousands, belonged to Baldwin. It was enough to fund fortifications, repairs, and new military campaigns for years. The Templars alone captured equipment sufficient to rearm every Christian garrison in the Levant. The impossible victory at Montgisard ignited a wave of hope across the Crusader territories. In Jerusalem, church bells rang for 3 days without pause. People filled the streets, praising God for a salvation so unlikely it bordered on myth. Mothers hugged their sons as though resurrected. Old men who had lived through decades of warfare said they had never seen such joy. In taverns and market squares, whispers spread that the leper king had been touched by the divine, that his suffering had granted him a clarity no healthy ruler could possess. But in the royal chamber, far from the cheers of the crowds, Baldwin lay hovering between life and death. The exertion of leading the charge, the strain of holding himself upright, the relentless agony of his disease, all of it had pushed him to the brink. Physicians warned that he might not survive the night. Every breath he took was thin and rattling, every movement a lance of pain. Yet when asked how he had found the strength to fight, the young king managed a faint smile behind his mask and whispered, "Pain means nothing when God requires service." He survived that night, and the next, and the next. For 8 more years, Baldwin IV ruled Jerusalem, each year defying the limits of his failing body. His eyesight faded until he could see almost nothing. His limbs stiffened until he could no longer walk. His hands, eaten away by disease, became nearly useless. Yet his mind remained sharp, his courage unbroken. Generals sought his counsel. Enemies respected his resolve. Saladin himself would one day confess, "I feared that man more than any army." The deep irony of Montgisard is that its miracle was temporary. The victory bought Jerusalem time, precious, irreplaceable time, to rebuild its defenses, strengthen alliances, and call for aid from Europe. but time is only as durable as the men who hold it. When Baldwin finally died in 1185 at the age of 24, the kingdom lost not just a ruler, but the spirit that had once made 500 stand against 26,000 without wavering. 2 years later, at the Battle of Hattin, Saladin would destroy the Crusader army, reclaim the Holy City, and reshape the fate of the Middle East for centuries. Some say he won at Hattin by applying the very lessons Baldwin had taught him at Montgisard. Never underestimate desperate men. Never assume victory before the battle begins. Never let confidence become carelessness. Yet despite the tragedy that followed, Montgisard remains a shining anomaly in the chronicles of war, a moment when belief outweighed numbers, when courage eclipsed calculation, when a dying king proved that the human spirit, once ignited, can bend the line of history. And so, long after the dust has settled, long after empires have risen and fallen, the legend endures that once, on a burning November day, 500 stood against 26,000, and the impossible bowed its head before them. In the months that followed the astonishing victory at Montgisard, the Crusader states awakened from a long sleep of fear. For years they had lived under the shadow of Saladin's unstoppable rise, watching fortress after fortress fall to his unbroken momentum. But Montgisard changed everything. For the first time, the Sultan had been forced into retreat, not through trickery or politics, but by brute, undeniable defeat. Every caravan road from Cairo to Damascus buzzed with the same incredulous question: how could 500 knights destroy an army of 26,000? The answers varied depending on who asked. Some spoke of divine intervention, others of miraculous luck, and still others of Baldwin's uncanny ability to read the terrain and the hearts of men. Whatever the explanation, one truth remained. The Crusader states had been granted a reprieve that no strategist could have predicted. That reprieve allowed Jerusalem to rebuild. Gold taken from Saladin's war chest poured into construction projects, reinforcing walls, expanding supply depots, and strengthening border fortresses long neglected. The Templars and Hospitallers gained new recruits eager to serve, under a king who had humiliated Islam's greatest commander. The merchants of Tyre and Acre, once preparing to abandon the kingdom, now invested in new trade lines and military ships. A sense of renewed confidence spread through the Crusader territories like a warm wind after a long winter. But the victory was not without cost, especially for the young king whose courage had made it possible. Baldwin's health declined rapidly. Each flare of his illness marked new territory lost to the relentless progression of leprosy. His fingers curled inward, stiffening until they barely resembled the hands of a boy who once trained eagerly with sword and shield. His face, hidden behind his mask, grew so sensitive that even a whisper of cold wind could send waves of pain through him. But Baldwin endured, because endurance was the one thing he had learned better than any king before him. He ruled from a litter, issued commands with hands he could scarcely feel, and faced each new day with a quiet resolve that inspired those around him. Visitors to the royal court often left with their expectations shattered. They would enter the chamber imagining a broken youth and instead find a leader whose voice remained as steady and commanding as the day he had ordered his knights to march to Montgisard. Diplomats from Byzantium, envoys from the Italian republics, and even spies from Saladin's court returned to their masters, describing Baldwin not as a tragic figure, but as a man whose presence held the weight of a seasoned monarch. His illness made his rule impressive. His spirit made it unforgettable. Meanwhile, Saladin moved cautiously along the borders, licking the wounds of his catastrophic defeat. His political alliances suffered strain as rival factions wondered whether God had abandoned his cause. The Sultan spent years reasserting authority, suppressing rebellions, and rebuilding trust among those who had once followed him without question. The setback at Montgisard forced him to relearn patience, a patience he would later wield with devastating effect. But for nearly a decade, Jerusalem was safe, not because its armies were strong, but because its enemies were uncertain. During those years, a strange respect grew between the two rulers. Though Saladin had every reason to despise Baldwin, he also understood the magnitude of what the young king had accomplished. Baldwin, for his part, recognized Saladin as a man forged by adversity and ambition, a leader whose discipline and piety mirrored his own. They were rivals shaped by destiny, each sharpening the other. Both knew the war between their faiths would not end with a single battle, yet both also sensed that history had granted them a rare moment of equilibrium. But time, merciless time, remained the only enemy Baldwin could not outmaneuver. By his early 20s, he had lost nearly all vision. A once nimble rider who had led the thunderous charge at Montgisard could no longer mount a horse without assistance. His joints stiffened, his skin cracked, and his strength waned with each passing season. Still, he governed with remarkable clarity, arranging treaties, managing feuding nobles, and preparing his kingdom for the inevitable conflict that would follow his death. His people loved him not because he was victorious, but because he never surrendered, neither to illness nor to fear. When Baldwin finally succumbed to the disease in 1185 at just 24 years old, Jerusalem mourned a king unlike any other. Bells tolled throughout the holy city as crowds gathered to honor the boy whose will had held back the greatest army of the age. Even Saladin, hearing of his passing, reportedly expressed a solemn respect, saying that Baldwin was the one man he had truly feared, not for his armies, but for his resolve. Baldwin's death left a vacuum that no successor could fill. Factions bickered, regents quarreled, and unity dissolved into ambition. The kingdom that had been saved by the courage of a dying teenager began to fracture. Without Baldwin's steady hand, long-standing rivalries resurfaced. Nobles who had once been held in check by the king's quiet authority now jostled for influence, their disputes weakening Jerusalem at the moment it needed strength the most. Saladin, patient and calculating, watched from afar as the Crusader states unraveled. The lessons he had learned from Montgisard became the foundation of his strategy. He would never again underestimate Christian forces. He would never again divide his army across miles of terrain. He would never again assume victory before the battle had begun. These lessons, carved into him by the terror of that November day, guided him as he rebuilt his army into a disciplined, unified force, stronger, wiser, and more determined than before. 2 years after Baldwin's death, in 1187, Saladin unleashed this reformed army upon the Crusader states. The climactic Battle of Hattin crushed the Christian forces and opened the road to Jerusalem. The holy city fell shortly after, ending nearly a century of Crusader rule. Yet even in that moment of triumph, the memory of Montgisard lingered like a scar, a reminder that no power, no matter how vast, was immune to the unexpected courage of a few. Montgisard became more than a battle. It became a symbol, a testament to the idea that numbers do not decide destiny, that faith can sharpen steel, and that sometimes the weakest body can house the strongest will. Kings, generals, and historians across the centuries have looked back on that day to remind themselves that warfare is not merely mathematics, but morale, not just strategy, but soul. They study it as proof that the impossible cannot be dismissed, because the impossible has already happened. And so the legend endures. A leper king whose hands bled with every movement held a sword he should not have been able to lift. 500 knights charged into 26,000 and emerged victorious. And for a brief, brilliant moment, the course of history bent to the will of a dying boy who refused to let his kingdom fall.